I was not surprised to find that my videos on Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, engendered a lot of enthusiastic responses. Some of them were very laudatory, but a great number of them, coming from Dawkins fans, were antagonistic, sometimes even hangry, and sometimes deeply derisive. That's not surprising. Dawkins, by his very nature, tends to polarize people because of the extreme claims that he makes. I expressed a lot of concerns about his content, where I disagreed with his thinking. I felt that he invoked sloppy logic, poor philosophy, and just made outrageous claims. And by the way, you don't have to be a Christian or even a theist to see that. Many of his critics are in fact atheistic scholars, including atheistic philosophers and scientists. I discussed that in my previous videos. One of them, for example, is the evolutionary biologist H. Alan Orr, who is himself an atheist and sympathetic to Dawkins' views in that regard. But he himself says, "I have no problem with where Dawkins arrived, but with how he got there. He agrees with Dawkins' atheism, but disagrees completely with the logic that Dawkins espoused in his book." I'd like to take this opportunity to respond to some of the objections that were raised, some of the hostile remarks that were given. You can think of this as a viewer mail segment, if you wish. One person said, "Big deal, all you've done is show that some people did not like the book." Now that's a rather bizarre objection. First of all, these are not just some people, these are like leading experts, atheistic and theistic philosophers alike, for example. Now, granted, this doesn't mean that they're automatically correct and that Dawkins is automatically wrong. However, the point is that these are not just some people. These are not just some Joe Schmoes on the street. These are experts in their field, people with far better credentials in philosophy than Dawkins had. Second, I did more than just show that people did not like the book. I explained some of the reasons why they did not like it, just scratching the surface, of course, due to time limitations. I also threw in some comments of my own regarding some of the fallacious thinking that Dawkins employed. So no, I wasn't just showing that some people were not fans of his, and you know it. One person said, "I'm surprised to see that you're appealing to authority." The implication being that appealing to authority is somehow fallacious. No, it isn't. People appeal to authority all the time. That's what you do every time you open a textbook or cite a historian. Heck, that's what people do when they cite Dawkins as a supposed expert in philosophy. I'll say more about that in a moment. You know, citing authorities, appealing to authorities is what expert testimony is all about. Now, there is something called the fallacy of appealing to authority, but that happens when you appeal to an authority on some matter that is outside his field of expertise. In fact, I would like to suggest that that's what people do when they cite Dawkins on his atheistic views. Again, I'm not saying that you need to be an expert in order to have valid views. What I'm pointing out is that if anyone's to be accused of committing the fallacy of appealing to authority, it's the people who cite Dawkins on matters of philosophy when it's something that is clearly beyond his ken, as actual experts will attest. One person said, "You know, you are misrepresenting what Dawkins said. Dawkins was just saying that he's not willing to jump to the conclusion that there is a God the way you do. He looks at design and he's not willing to jump to that conclusion. He is withholding judgment." I find that claim rather surprising. See, Dawkins did far more than just say he's withholding judgment for now. Quite the contrary, he offered what he believed was a very strong argument against God's existence. In fact, one of his chapters was titled, "Why There Almost Certainly Is No God." He also declared his complexity-based proof to be unanswerable. One of his other books, The Blind Watchmaker, was subtitled, "Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design." Again, that is far more than just withholding judgment and not being willing to jump to a conclusion. In fact, look at the title of the book we're discussing, The God Delusion. That's a very strong claim. Dawkins clearly was not merely saying that he's not ready to arrive at any conclusion just yet. Quite the contrary, he was offering what he believed was a very strong argument against God's existence. And he did so badly. Predictably, people said, "But evolution is true. You need to understand that evolution is a fact." I'd like to respond in multiple ways. One is that I took great pains to emphasize that I was not building a case based on the truth or falsity of evolution. In fact, he quite clearly said that I was willing to grant, for the sake of argument, again, for the sake of argument, that evolution could explain away all appearance of biological design in the world. I did not agree with that claim, but I said, let's accept it for now and focus on other ways in which Dawkins' argument clearly fails. Second, I don't deny that evolution exists. I don't deny that evolution occurs. I do believe that it is not sufficient to explain the complexity of life on Earth. In other words, there are certain things it's not adequate to explain. But that is very different from stating that I don't believe evolution occurs at all. We could debate all day long about the extent to which evolution occurs. We could talk about, about information theory and microevolution, macroevolution, and so forth and so on. But that's ultimately irrelevant. The real question is, can it explain everything? I don't believe it does. And even if it did, I wasn't basing my argument on that. One person said, what's the difference? What's the difference between saying that evolution is true and that evolution can explain all the biological complexity in the world? I think the difference is pretty obvious, frankly. Those are entirely different claims, even at first glance. But just to drive the point home, consider this. I believe that certain illnesses are psychosomatic. In other words, I believe that psychosomatic illnesses occur. These are illnesses that are physical in nature, but that originate in the human mind. Does this mean that I believe that all illness can be attributed to psychosomatic causes? Obviously not, and nor would any thinking person nowadays. You can believe that something exists, that something occurs, without believing that it accounts for all the phenomena in that field. I pointed out how Dawkins' complexity-based argument and his definition of complexity assumes that God is material, that God is someone who evolved, and that evolution is what produces complexity. That is, by the way, a blatantly circular argument. But at any rate, one person said, you haven't proved that God is non-material. You haven't proven that God is spirit. I'd like to respond in a couple of ways. First of all, we do have good independent reason to believe that God is non-material. In fact, I would argue that, various cosmological arguments are based on that. I would argue, for example, that whoever created all of matter would have to be composed of something other than matter, or more accurately, would have to be non-material, non-corporeal. More importantly, though, Dawkins was the one who was attacking the concept of God, and traditional concepts of God, not just Christian, but in great many other religions, do espouse a God who is non-corporeal, non-material. It does no good for Dawkins to supposedly attack the concept of God and yet attribute entirely different characteristics to that deity. If he's going to do his job, if he's going to attack the existence of God, he's got to attack God the way he is described, or show how God must necessarily be material in nature. He did neither. In other words, remember, he's the one who's arguing that God cannot possibly exist. If he's to postulate a material God, that's attacking a straw man. That's attacking a position other than what religionists traditionally hold to be true. Speaking of which, again, predictably, more than one person said, you still haven't proven that God exists. This frustrates me greatly. You know what? This objection comes up all the time in these videos. You haven't proven that God exists. Guess what? I wasn't trying to prove that God exists. I was attacking Dawkins' arguments in his book, The God Delusion. I don't need to prove that God exists to show that his arguments do not logically hold water. In fact, the greatest indication of that is the fact that a great many atheists, people who are in his camp, people who reject God's existence, also reject Dawkins' thinking. You don't have to prove God's existence to show that Dawkins was founding careless philosophy. I think that's pretty self-evident. Dawkins has a large and dedicated fan base, so I'm sure that people will continue to defend his writings, not because of the accuracy of his facts or logic, but because they like his conclusion and his arguments sound good, sound compelling. By the way, Christians do the same thing when it comes to Christian writers that they like, so I'm not just, slinging mud arbitrarily at one side here. We need to go beyond that, though. In other words, we need to go where the evidence points, and when somebody employs sloppy logic, that's a good reason to abandon his work, to abandon his writings. This man is given far too much credibility. Thankfully not among scholars, but unfortunately among lay people, and that can be very damaging indeed.